Good afternoon, and welcome to you all, to Dean Hellman, our very many honored guest. Special welcome to His Excellency Nasser Judah, Centennial Fellow, among many other things, and to all of the students who have joined us this afternoon, and of course, to our honored recipient of this year's Raymond Jit Trainor Award for Excellence in the Conduct of Diplomacy, the Honorable Madeleine K. Albright. I am Barbara Bodine, and I have both the privilege and the pleasure of serving as the director of the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at the School of Foreign Service here at Georgetown. Each year about this time, it is my honor to welcome guests to the Trainor Lecture and Award to celebrate the work and the commitment of the best of global citizens whose careers exemplify the highest standards of service to others. Each year, I reread the list of past recipients, and I am in awe of the contribution each has made to creating a better, safer world, a world that reflects what President Roosevelt called the four freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Within each of those freedoms, in order to guarantee each of those freedoms, is a world with governments that reflect and respond to the needs of their people, who recognize the inherent dignity and rights of each person, of governments that create economic opportunity for each, but also create personal opportunity, and that ensure that each child can grow up safe, secure, and able to reach her full potential. And also a world order that is based on these very basic and fundamental rights. A world that creates both the tools and the incentives to move forward, and that has the credibility and the means to ensure that those standards are met. While each global citizen and each government has not only the right, but the responsibility to be part of that effort, it is the diplomat and diplomacy that is charged with furthering not only their own country's interest and their own people's interest, but understanding how those interests and those goals can best be affected globally and in cooperation, one hopes, with like-minded states and like-minded people, and also knows when and how to step in to avert, mitigate, resolve, and move forward if the circumstances demand. This work is done day in and day out by diplomats on the ground, often in less than glamorous spots and often dealing with people that are less than ideal partners. But to be successful, they need strong, principled, and effective leadership. Leadership that understands the why of the work that must be done, why engagement is not a luxury, but a requirement. Leadership that understands the how of that work and also understands the who. That leadership comes first and foremost from our elected leaders, but it is most fundamentally the charge of the Secretary of State. And this afternoon we recognize and honor one of the best and one of our own, Madeleine Albright. Dean Hellman will introduce Secretary Professor Albright shortly and expand on her life of public service. But I want to add a few words on what public service means, a question that I know that many of our students here and elsewhere wrestle with. At its simplest, it means to serve others, to work on and towards something larger than yourself, to understand that you are part of a community that is larger than your neighborhood, your family, and your friends. It is a community of people that you do not know and that you may never meet, whose lives are different from yours, but whose aspirations are the same. It is empathy with a focus. It is empathy with a purpose. It is a willingness and ability to see, to truly see others as full human beings. It is the ability to listen hard, but also the ability to speak out and to act, and to give back. This afternoon, we honor such a person, and we are honored by her commitment to our community, the global community. It is also my pleasure to welcome you all to a very special birthday party. This year, this month, marks the 40th anniversary of the establishment of the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy. The Institute seeks to do nothing less than bring together the best of academic minds and the most experienced practitioners to better understand the critical role of diplomacy, as distinct from its cousin, international relations theory, and its sibling, foreign policy. The critical role of diplomacy as part of what Secretary Albright calls in her preeminent class, America's Toolkit. And the Institute's goal is to take that knowledge and that understanding of both the policy world, but as important, to students, to those who aspire to be the next generation of scholars, and also those who aspire to be the next generation of policymakers. If successful diplomacy is a long game, an incremental game, and very much a quiet game, there is no rolling thunder in diplomacy. So too is the work of the Institute. And for that, I would like to thank the school and successive deans, and most especially Dean Hellman, for the wisdom to create the Institute and the support to keep it going for all these decades and for many decades to come. And so, as a former diplomat who remains proud of my colleagues and proud of my profession, and as a member of this academic community where I remain not shocked by my students, but certainly in awe of them and their commitment, I'd like to welcome you again to this afternoon's Trainor Lecture and Award. The Trainor Lecture and Award honors the legacy of J. Raymond Jit Trainor. And I would like to introduce now Frank Hogan, who is the chair of the Board of Trustees of the Trainor Foundation, an alum of the Walsh School of Foreign Service, cum laude, and a student of Jit Trainor. Frank is also a valued member of our Board of Advisors. As chairman since 1984 of the Overseas Service Corporation, he has been a pioneer in sales to U.S. military commissaries, exchanges, and other government entities. He brings a touch of home to U.S. service members and their families worldwide. A veteran himself, a Marine, the father of a Marine, the grandfather of a Marine, he attended school on the GI Bill, and as a veteran, he understands the need to give back. 55% of his workforce are veterans or family members. And for those of you who aspire to follow in his footsteps, and he is an excellent role model to follow, I will point out that he started out in the mailroom while he was still in college, and he worked his way up to become a true global citizen and a great supporter of this university and this school and this award. Frank?
Secretary Albright, Dean Hellman, Ambassador Bodine, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and warm greetings to all. It's a great pleasure to speak with you today on behalf of the award the endowment that makes the Trainor Award possible. The Trainor Award and lecture series celebrates excellence in the conduct of diplomacy. It was established by the alumni of the School of Foreign Service as a living memorial to J. Raymond Jit Trainor. The trustees of the Trainor Endowment could not be more delighted to honor you, Secretary Albright, on this important occasion, the opening celebration of the 40th anniversary of the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy. You and your illustrious career, including your long association with the Georgetown School of Foreign Service, represent the very essence of the Trainor Award. It is also timely that we recognize you at this moment in history when the value of dialogue and diplomacy, something to which you've devoted your entire life, seem challenged as never before. We look forward to your remarks today with great anticipation. When J. Raymond Trainor entered Georgetown as an eager young freshman in 1923, we can be sure he had no inkling that he would remain with this great institution for the next 33 years, let alone leave such an important legacy. Doubtless he did not anticipate either that he would pick up a nickname that would stay with him the rest of his life. From the jitney, the Uber of its day, I guess you might say, he drove while a student to help make ends meet. Jit made his mark at the School of Foreign Service as secretary. In that capacity, he guided it with a steady hand and enjoyed the complete confidence of the school's founder, the renowned Father Edmund A. Walsh. However, what made Jit so special was his unwavering focus on his students. They were the family he and his wife never had. Though he had opportunities to be dean, Jit declined them for fear that it would lessen his contact with his students. Ready listener, wise counselor, older friend, surrogate parent, and father confessor, perhaps as well as educator, born educator, probably described Jit's intersection with his students, including the returning veterans from World War I, later the financially strapped students from the Depression era, and still later, returning veterans from World War II and Korea. Jit was the go-to person when a student needed some extra assistance, some extra encouragement, confidential advice, perhaps a loan, and yes, even a gentle or not so gentle nudge. When Jit retired, a feature article in the Courier, the student magazine of its day, perhaps captured him best with the headline, "His door was always open." He was ever approachable and ever giving of himself. On a personal note, I arrived at Georgetown at the very end of Jit's tenure, but was privileged to get to know him quite well in his retirement years. I shall be eternally grateful for his invaluable counsel and support during the early stages of my career. Jit meant so much to an entire generation of students that there was a groundswell among the alumni to recognize his legacy upon his death in 1976. What better way, indeed, to remember him than to create an award for excellence in the conduct of diplomacy? By establishing the Trainor Endowment, the trustees and the School of Foreign Service alumni hope that we have contributed to the spirit and traditions of this great university. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And our thanks to all of the children of Jit Trainor for how much they give back to this university to this day. As I said in my opening remarks, the Institute would not be here, I would not be here, if it were not for the support ISD has received over 4 decades from the School of Foreign Service and from its deans. And Dean Hellman is no exception. Now in his 3rd year at the helm, which may be almost a pun, sorry, you need to read your remarks out loud sometimes just to be sure. Yes, the man at the helm, Dean Hellman, embodies the scholar practitioner. He brings a unique and valuable perspective to his work on issues of governance, conflict, and the political economy of development around the world. He joined SFS after 15 years of service at the World Bank with a focus on fragile and conflict-afflicted states. He graduated from Williams College and went on to earn a PhD from Columbia and a master's in philosophy from Oxford. He was a member of the faculty at Harvard and Columbia prior to joining the World Bank and we could not be more pleased to have both a scholar and a practitioner of his renown as our dean. Dean Hellman.
Thanks so much, Barb, for that kind introduction. And thank you, and welcome to you all. I'd like to first thank Frank Hogan, the chair of the Trainor Foundation, and Allison Kropp and Robert McHugh, also of the foundation, for their active support of this annual event and of the school's legacy as a place where students come first and alumni give back. I'd also like to thank the Michael and Virginia Mortara Foundation, support for the Mortara Center for International Studies, and their endowed Mortara Distinguished Professorship in the Practice of Diplomacy held by our honoree and our valued colleague, the Honorable Madeleine K. Albright. We have many very distinguished guests with us this afternoon, and perhaps one of the largest gatherings of American diplomats outside the Department of State, which at the moment is not a very difficult benchmark to achieve. My one dig. I also wish to acknowledge the members of the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy's Board of Advisors. Your engagement for the work of the Institute and support have set a very high bar for us. We are in the face of great uncertainty in the future of American diplomacy. But I, for one, take great optimism in the continued dedication of our students to global public service, as evidenced by the great turnout here today. The Trainor Award is always a special occasion for the school and for the university. It's an award established by the alumni of the school to honor a man, a former registrar and administrator at SFS, whose impact on the lives was so fundamental, so consequential that they created a living legacy to his memory. Today's award and lecture are also special because it marks the start of a year's celebration of the 40th anniversary of the establishment of the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy by this school and this university. 40 years ago, Dean Crow and a number of senior American diplomats recognized that it was critically important to draw as a core tool in our country's national security toolkit, diplomacy, that it needed to be better understood. It needed to be studied, to be conducted wisely and effectively in our own interests and the interest of a better world. Scholars and practitioners understood that their two worlds needed to pool their respective talents and share their respective experience and expertise on the nexus of theory and practice, built upon the rich resources in Washington to create scholarship, advance knowledge, educate the next generation of diplomats and policymakers to conduct better diplomacy. The work of the Institute, as understood by its founders and carried out by successive directors, staff, and fellows across the world, is as relevant today and as necessary today, perhaps even more so today than it was 40 years ago in 1978. So it's wonderful to wish a happy birthday to ISD and wish that it continues to serve as an integral part of our school and our community. But how better to mark ISD's celebration and continue Jit Trainor's legacy than by honoring Madam Secretary Madeleine Albright. Secretary Albright's career of global service, of extraordinary scholarship, extraordinary teaching, preeminent diplomacy and engagement, and excellence in the conduct of diplomacy and service exemplify the core values of ISD and the work of Jit Trainor. And who more appropriate than Madeleine Albright, who began the arc of her career coincident with ISD's in 1978, 40 years ago, at the National Security Council working for her former professor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, whose son, Ambassador Mark Brzezinski, is with us today. Secretary Albright perhaps needs no introduction, President Clinton's ambassador to the UN, and precedent-shattering appointment as the first women's Secretary of State. She was and remains the highest-ranking woman in the history of the United States. Secretary Albright's commitment, her dedication to public service, neither began nor ended with formal government service. 8 years at the center of U.S. policy, Secretary Albright remains, to this day, a strong, credible, and influential voice in global affairs and policy debates within this country and around the world. She continues to advocate forcefully for a dynamic foreign policy grounded most certainly on the protection and advancement of our interests, but equally and most emphatically grounded on our principles and our values, and one most properly and necessarily in a democracy on bipartisanship. She has described herself as a pragmatic idealist, in equal parts and at times confounding to both the pure pragmatist and the pure idealist, but never muddled in her goals, nor ambiguous in her words. In fact, she invented a whole new vocabulary for diplomats everywhere. Read my pins. She embodies the best of America, a refugee from both the Nazis and the Soviets who rose to the highest levels of our government in service to her adopted country, but committed to defending those unable to speak, unable to act, but with the aspirations and rights shared by us all. Just a few of her many commitments include the chairperson of the National Democratic Institute, president of the Truman Scholarship Foundation, co-chair of the Commission of Legal Empowerment of the Poor, former chairwoman of the Council of Women World Leaders, chairman of the Hague Institute for Global Justice. And in her spare time, she has authored a memoir, Reflections on Her Childhood in Prague, the Mighty and the Almighty, Reflections on America, God, and World Affairs. And of course, Read My Pin. And we're very excited about an upcoming book next month that will be launching here. And finally, there is Professor Albright and her America's Toolkit course, perhaps the most highly sought after course on this campus. I've been privileged as dean to travel all over the world and meet our alumni. And I can't tell you how many alumni have described the course as the most influential part of their Georgetown and SFS experience. This is true public service, the giving back, the commitment to the next generation, the engagement with all of these bright young people who came to Georgetown and the school as aspiring diplomats and global citizens who see Secretary Albright as who they want to be, what they hope to accomplish, the change they hope they can make in the world, as you, Secretary Albright, have done for so many, for so long, in so many places. So, Secretary Albright, let me thank you. We look forward to hearing your thoughts on diplomacy in defense of democracy. You once said, "It took me quite a long time to develop a voice, and now that I have it, I am not going to be silent." The floor is yours.
Thank you very, very much, Dean Hellman, for your very kind introduction and your friendship. It's wonderful to have you here and to have you be a part of this incredible institution. And I really want to thank the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy and Frank Hogan for the Trainor Foundation and for this honor. And I have to say, it truly is an honor because Trainor really is a legend at Georgetown. And so to have that honor to receive this award, I thank you very, very much, and I really am deeply moved by it. As has been said, this is the 40th anniversary of ISD that works to bridge the gap between international relations theory and practice. And that is definitely a mission that I believe in very dearly, because I have seen what happens when they don't go together. And you mentioned that I was at the National Security Council in the late 70s, and after the invasion of the Soviets into Afghanistan, we had a meeting where Dr. Brzezinski and Secretary Vance were trying to explain to the people why we did it. And there were the opinion leaders, and then there were the theoreticians, and it was like this. And I thought, this is ridiculous. Why can't we work more to bring theory and practice together? And so one of the reasons that I was really excited to come to Georgetown to teach was that I had seen that disconnect, and I really was very happy to be a part of working on some connection. I knew that this university was committed to bringing the communities together, and I really am pleased to see that commitment continue. So I applaud ISD for everything that's doing under the leadership of Ambassador Bodine, who has been one of the finest ambassadors that this country has ever had. And I was honored to have her be an ambassador when I was in office. And she was in Yemen, and we are about to do our role play on Yemen, so you are welcome to. But really in one of the most complicated times, and I know what an incredible job and how difficult it was, so hats off to you. So while I'm still best known for a certain diplomatic position I held back when Bill Clinton was president and dinosaurs roamed the earth, the truth is that I have spent most of my career at this university, and I've now taught at the School of Foreign Service much longer than I served in the government. And for that privilege, I'm grateful to many people here, and very grateful to you, Dean Hellman, for asking me to stay. And all the nice things you say about my course. And I really am very happy to be with our fellow faculty members and the students that I've had, some of whom came today. I don't know whether voluntarily or not, but anyway, it's very nice to see you. The theme of this year's Trainor Award is Diplomacy in Defense of Democracy. And today I'd like to share some reflections on the challenges facing democracy and democratization. But I'd like to begin on a personal note. I am the daughter of a Czechoslovak diplomat, and my father was ambassador to Yugoslavia when I was a little girl, and I am the little girl that wore a national costume and gave flowers at the airport. That's what I did for a living. So that's where I learned my initial diplomacy. And then my father came to the United States and defected and asked for political asylum and became a professor at the University of Denver. And he said, there is nothing better than to be a professor in a free country. So I am wearing my Statue of Liberty pin today. So I received my master's degree some 50 years ago this spring, and like today, it was an era of great turbulence. Our best and brightest civilian leaders had involved America in a distant war, and our soldiers were in an impossible position, bogged down inside an alien culture, unable to distinguish friend from foe. And here at home, America was divided along geographical, racial, and cultural lines. Overseas, critics called our policies arrogant, imperialistic, and doomed to fail. I was a close observer of all this, but not really a participant. My main goal in life was to make sure that I had turned my papers in on time. And my excuse is that Vietnam was far away, while my professor Zbigniew Brzezinski was close at hand. And neither I nor any of my fellow students were brave enough to show up in Dr. Brzezinski's class with flowers in our hair. So I'm sure that, Mark, you can appreciate this. But I was also a mother and a student, and not a peacenik or a rebel, frankly. But Brzezinski and my other professors did teach me to think deeply about the nature and purpose of American leadership, and to ask questions about how we could protect our vital interests while still being true to our basic values, about how we could use our power wisely, not only for the right purposes, but also with the right results, about how we could win the battle of ideas against the enemies of freedom, and about how we could lead in a way that would encourage others to follow. Those questions were relevant during the Vietnam War, and they remain relevant today as we fight an even lengthier conflict and as divisions resurface at home about whether, how, and why America should engage in the world. Those questions are also very broad, too broad for me to cover this afternoon in anything resembling a comprehensive way. So, in keeping with this lecture's theme, let me talk about American interests and values in the context of democracy. And let me talk about democracy in the context of U.S. foreign policy. This democratic debate is very much on people's minds today because of troubling trends that are in evidence in many countries, including our own. But I want first to take a step back and remind this audience that our wisest leaders have always understood that American foreign policy must be shaped not solely on the basis of what we are against, but also what we are for. And our interests still dictate that we should be for a world in which democracy is defended and universal values upheld. Of course, the question of whether democracy is worth supporting has never been an academic one for me. And as I said, I was born in Czechoslovakia where freedom was never assured. And those of you who are familiar with Czech history may be aware that everything of importance seems to happen in a year that ends in 8, which means we have a number of anniversaries coming up. In October, we will mark 100 years since the Czechoslovak Republic was founded, with a great friendship between the first president of Czechoslovakia, Thomas Masaryk, and Woodrow Wilson. In September, we will mark 80 years since the Munich Agreement, which sacrificed our sovereignty in the name of appeasing Hitler. And later this month, we will commemorate the 70th anniversary of the 1948 communist coup, which overthrew the democratic government formed in the aftermath of World War II. The coup ushered in 4 decades of one-party rule, although that would be challenged 20 years later by the events of the Prague Spring in 1968, which, sure enough, did have to end in an 8. But it was the Czech coup that would have the most direct impact on me because it forced us into exile, and a few months later, we did make our way to the United States, where we were welcomed as refugees and given the priceless opportunity to begin our lives again in freedom. The impact of the coup also reverberated globally, hastening the passage of the Marshall Plan, the birth of NATO, and the reorienting of U.S. foreign policy around the defense of democracy and the containment of communism. The decades that followed provided ample proof of the wisdom of that policy. In the 1950s and 1960s, democracy helped Germany and Japan become integrated into the world economy and evolve into key allies of the United States. In the 1980s, the promise of freedom inspired Solidarity, the Velvet Revolution, and other movements that lifted the Iron Curtain and ended Cold War security threats. The democratic gains that followed in the 1990s inspired the enlargement of NATO and opened the door to expansion of the European Union. In this hemisphere, the spread of democracy allowed the United States to work with our neighbors more closely than ever to broaden prosperity, address social ills, and expand the rule of law. The growth and consolidation of democracy also enabled countries in the Asia-Pacific region, including Indonesia, India, and South Korea, to become economic and strategic partners for the United States. And democracy helped bring about improvements in development, health, and security across the African continent. When the Cold War ended, many felt democracy had passed its biggest test and was marching on the right side of history. But in the years since, the sense of euphoria has dissipated. The financial crisis and growing gaps between rich and poor have fueled anger and deepened doubts about the capacity of democracy to deliver on its promises. The war in Iraq, which brought neither stability nor liberty to the Middle East, gave promotion of freedom a bad name, since that became one of the justifications. I have to say, one of the more interesting meetings that I attended at the White House once I'd left was one that President George W. Bush held with a lot of former people like me in order to persuade us about the value of what was going on in Iraq. And I have to say, I think some of you have had this experience of going back to the White House or the State Department or the Defense Department where you had worked when you no longer actually have anything to do with what's going on there. But it all looks the same, and sometimes the portraits are changed, but mostly it looks the same. So there we were in the Roosevelt Room, and President Bush comes in, and we've just been briefed, and he said, I want you to make absolutely sure that you keep supporting democracy in the Middle East, and that you have to keep doing that. So the meeting was over, and President Bush actually said to me, would you like to see how I've redecorated the Oval Office? So I go in, and I did do the following thing, and I said, Mr. President, I'm so glad that you are saying that we need to support democracy, but you act as though you invented democracy when actually I did. And he did laugh. Technology, which was one thought of as a democratizing force, has also proven to be a double-edged sword. Social media has disaggregated voices and made governing much more difficult. And in recent years, it has been co-opted by freedom's foes, who are now adept at polluting social media platforms with rumors, disinformation, and authoritarian propaganda. And all this led many to declare that democracy is in crisis, as Freedom House did in its annual global survey issued last month. Like other studies put out by The Economist and the Bertelsmann Foundation, the Freedom House report finds that political rights and civil liberties around the world have deteriorated to the lowest point in more than a decade. Progress in a few key countries and regions, these organizations conclude, has been more than overshadowed by renewed authoritarianism in Turkey, the rise of illiberal parties in Europe, state collapse in an authoritarian Venezuela, and the onset of an Arab winter across much of the Middle East. These reports also document how the world's autocracies are working to undermine democracy while positioning themselves as an alternative model. Russia's interference in democratic processes around the world has now been documented by the intelligence community, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and other authoritative sources, including in a speech not long ago by George W. Bush. It is undeniable and it is deeply disturbing. Yet perhaps what is most alarming has been the response from the United States government, or rather the lack of one. Because instead of rebutting and challenging anti-democratic forces across the globe, we now have a president who has become a source of comfort to them. His administration has also simultaneously expressed a disdain for diplomacy and seems content for the United States to take a back seat in international affairs, which has worried our allies and delighted our competitors. Just in the past year, we have seen this administration step away from America's historic commitment to human rights, withdraw from key international agreements such as the Paris Accords and TPP, and transform the U.S. from a partner to a pariah at the United Nations. They have also tried unsuccessfully so far to slash the State Department budget, with the latest proposal announced earlier today, and Congress making it very clear that it was dead on arrival. All this would be troubling enough on its own, but what we are seeing has disturbing echoes. It recalls the narrow vision naysayers that flourished in America in the 1920s and 1930s, the people who rejected the League of Nations, embraced protectionism, downplayed the rise of fascism, opposed help to the victims of aggression, and ultimately endangered our own security, claiming all the while that all they were doing was putting America first. The isolationists were wrong in the 1930s, and they are wrong now. Their view of our national interest is too narrow, their view of history too short, and their sense of public opinion, I believe, will ultimately be proven wrong. That's because most Americans understand that what happens in the world affects almost every aspect of our lives. They also understand that diplomacy is an indispensable foreign policy tool for one very basic reason. There is hardly a major challenge in the world today that does not require countries to work together, from fighting terrorism and nuclear proliferation to curbing the spread of illegal narcotics and epidemic disease. The role of diplomats is to foster that cooperation, and America's responsibility is to lead. We are a peace-loving nation that is democratic, economically dynamic, and respectful of the law. We will do better and feel safer in an environment where our values are widely shared, markets are open, military clashes are constrained, and those who run roughshod over the rights of others are made to change. Embracing isolationism or supporting authoritarians will do nothing to create such an environment. Helping other democracies will help to change. And the question is, how do we go about doing that? More than 35 years ago, in a speech to the British Parliament, President Reagan outlined what would prove to be one of his best and most far-sighted ideas, the National Endowment for Democracy. President Reagan said at Westminster, and I quote, that our military strength is a prerequisite to peace, But the ultimate determinant in the struggle that's now going on in the world will not be bombs and rockets, but a test of wills and ideas, a trial of spiritual resolve, the values we hold, the beliefs we cherish, the ideals to which we are dedicated," unquote. Those words remain true today as the cement appears to be hardening on a new global split between democratic and undemocratic forces. As chairman of the National Democratic Institute, which also grew out of President Reagan's speech, I'm proud to be a part of what has become a global network that is working to help democracies succeed. I know from my own experience that this can be exhilarating but humbling work, because in any society, building democracy is never easy and never fully accomplished. It is something to be worked towards step by step, country by country, day by day. The National Democratic Institute's efforts to support democracy are reinforced by those of other non-governmental organizations, human rights monitors, religious groups, foreign governments, and regional organizations. Together, they represent the international architecture of democracy support, which is stronger than it has ever been. But America belongs at the head of the movement, for freedom is perhaps the clearest expression of national purpose and policy ever adopted, and it must be the star by which American diplomacy navigates in the years to come. Our current leadership in the executive branch may not fully appreciate this reality, but the genius of our system is that here the government is not one man or woman. The government is us. So I've been pleased to see Republicans and Democrats in Congress step in to protect funding for diplomacy and democracy assistance. I also took note that the President's own national security strategy recognizes that supporting democracy in other countries is fully consistent with what, by necessity, is our top priority, protecting the safety and security of the American people. And that's why the United States continues to use pro-democracy tools, including diplomatic, military, and economic pressure in places as diverse as Cambodia, Cuba, Egypt, Ukraine, and Venezuela. All my adult life, I have heard people say that this region or that culture or those countries were not ready for democracy. And I've replied by stating my conviction that no country has ever been truly ready for anything else. I've also often heard from so-called foreign policy experts who argue that there is little connection between fostering democratic practices and the hard-headed pursuit of American interests. To them, I simply point to a country such as Syria, where U.S. security interests were directly affected by the collapse of an authoritarian regime and the outbreak of civil war. And while it's hard to find bright spots in a massive humanitarian tragedy, there is a story of democratic resilience unfolding there right now. In liberated territories across northern Syria, citizens groups are coming together to identify community needs, and local administrative councils, some democratically elected, are responding by providing critical services. All this prompted one regional news outlet to report, and I quote, "You may think Syrians are condemned to an unpleasant choice between Bashar al-Assad and the jihadists, but the real choice being fought out by Syrians is between violent authoritarianism on the one hand and grassroots democracy on the other," unquote. Of course, even as groups such as NDI try to help and support these local councils, there are those who see democracy anywhere as a threat to their power, and at the top of that list is Vladimir Putin. Putin's immediate aims are to extend his influence into the Middle East and Eastern Europe, weaken NATO and the EU, and create a wedge between the United States and its allies. But his long-term objective is to tear down democratic institutions in the West and around the world. His strategy is clear, and it demands a forceful and unified response. Last year, Congress overwhelmingly passed new sanctions authorities on Russia, and while the administration has so far declined to impose new sanctions, they're coming under more and more pressure to do so from Democrats and Republicans alike. This unity is important because the only way Putin can succeed is if democracy's guardians are too complacent, too timid, or too divided to stop him. And that means we cannot turn Russian interference into a partisan issue. It's a threat to our institutions, to both of our political parties, and to our allies abroad. We cannot forget that. But even as we turn up the pressure on Russia, we also need to recognize that the tools and techniques they've used to undermine democracy have spread beyond the exclusive control of any regime. Authoritarian governments around the world are using what's known as computational propaganda to assert control over their own populations. They're weaponizing information as their totalitarian forebears once did. What is interesting to me is to compare what we are seeing now to what I studied during the Cold War when I researched the role of information in political change, including that period in 1968 known as the Prague Spring. In the days of the Soviet Union, people largely knew that official sources of information could not be trusted, so they built unofficial channels that were more reliable, for example, talking to friends and family or listening to Radio Free Europe. In the internet age, it is these unofficial channels that are becoming reliable, and at the same time, people do not seem to have yet developed a healthy skepticism about what others are sharing online. This may be changing, so awareness about this problem grows as companies and governments take action, but we cannot wait for this to happen organically. We need a global, long-term response to these new threats to democracy. And that's why at NDI we have launched a major new project to protect the integrity of democracy in the digital age. This initiative has several components. We're conducting new opinion research to help us better understand which populations are most vulnerable to digital propaganda and how to build resilience. We're working to strengthen international election observation methodologies to include efforts to detect, expose, and counter disinformation, leveraging a network of more than 3 million citizen election monitors worldwide. We're also working with political parties to agree on ground rules regarding online campaign conduct, while developing and sharing techniques to detect and disrupt disinformation efforts. But perhaps the most important component of our effort is to try to help foster constructive engagement between government, civil society, and technology firms on these issues. I hope that together we can devise innovative ideas and not fall victim to a disconnect best summed up by a line I plagiarized from Silicon Valley. Students, do not listen. What they said was, citizens are speaking to their governments using 21st century technology. Governments are listening to them on 20th century technology and providing 19th century responses. We need 21st century responses to the challenge facing democracy today, and that will depend on having leaders who understand the difficulty of governing in a wired world, on institutions such as the School of Foreign Service and the Institute for Study of Diplomacy, who are training such leaders and helping inspire them to serve. I'm often asked whether I'm an optimist or a pessimist. I reply that I'm an optimist who worries a lot. I worry for all the obvious reasons, but I'm an optimist because I truly believe in the universal validity of democratic ideals and the resilience of free societies. Our American democracy has endured despite the periodic eruption of deep divisions, gridlock, and partisanship. We have faced many, many setbacks as a country, but we've always found solutions, not by bowing to the false gods of nationalism, but by building better, more flexible, and responsive institutions. As President Kennedy once said, democracy is never a final achievement. It is a call to untiring effort. I mentioned earlier that this year of anniversaries for me, and I want to conclude by sharing the lessons behind these memories, lessons which have informed my worldview and my approach to diplomacy. Aggressors must be resisted. Intolerance can never again be allowed to hide behind the mask of nationalist pride, and the siren song of isolationism must not again distract us from the responsibilities of leadership. I hope we will bear these lessons in mind, and I hope we will remember that although we live in a world of change, what matters most must not change, and that is our basic commitment to democratic values, our respect for one another, and our commitment to justice and the dignity of every human being. Without those principles in front of us, we will lose our way, but with them beside us, we will not go wrong. So my thanks again go to the ISD and the Trainor Foundation and Georgetown for this really very, very meaningful award, and to all of you for your kind attention. And now I look forward to our discussion and questions, and since I'm no longer in the government, I will be able to answer your questions.
Well, thank you, Secretary Albright, and for your kind words. You most certainly did find your voice, and you use it with clarity, intelligence, and a great deal of force. And so I thank you for that. You've given us much to consider, much to think about, much to worry about, and also some hope. And the hope is that we have the wisdom to listen to your lessons, and we also have your courage to act on those principles. I have enough questions, areas to expand on to keep us all here till probably Thursday, but I will try to bring it down to a few and then open it up to the floor. About a year ago, I had the opportunity to attend a remarkable event that was jointly sponsored by the National Democratic Institute and the International Republican Institute, the twin sides of the National Endowment for Democracy. And the focus of this event was on the need to rediscover and reaffirm bipartisanship or nonpartisanship in policy. And you had a fascinating colloquy with Senator McCain that evening that I very much recall. As you mentioned, Congress has done much to push back on the worst of the draconian cuts. The efforts to basically gut the State Department and USAID, and much of it has been a bipartisan effort. Yet the budget deal that passed recently cut our budget. I'm sorry, I've been out of the State Department a while, but it is still we. Our budget, our government's budget, our State Department's budget. Slashed it again, and then what came out just today would cut it again. How do we do effective diplomacy? How do we regain our role, our effective role, if diplomacy is not only being disdained, but is being dismembered? I know many of your students, many of my students, and their friends, they want to serve, they want to engage, they want to follow in your footsteps. The question is, will they be able to? We've met the enemy, and he is us. And can Congress save us, and how do we support that? How do we make that happen?
Well, I have been up on the Hill a lot, and I keep talking about the fact that it's Article 1 time. The first article of the Constitution is, in fact, about the power of Congress, and the power is the purse. And then as I teach my course, I always talk about the fact that every one of the tools needs to be activated by Congress. We are a government of 3 parts, and I think that what is very important at this stage for people is to focus on Congress, because they have recognized the fact that the budgets that have been proposed by the administration are crazy. They really, and they have been proposed by the director of OMB, Mr. Mulvaney, who also has weird views. So,
weird and crazy are very diplomatic terms.
Yes. By the way, I always say the world is a mess. That's a diplomatic term.
That's also
yeah. So, but the bottom line is, I think that we need to understand the role that diplomacy plays. Again, on my course, I always say it's the bread and butter tool. It is the way that you can support the use of force or the economic tools that we have and law enforcement, that it is absolutely essential. And to see it as kind of a misunderstanding of what diplomacy does is very narrow-minded in so many different ways. I think that there are friends on the Hill, And they may be people that you might disagree with under other circumstances. But I went up to the Hill and I talked to Lindsey Graham, who is one of the people that has been the most helpful. He, in fact, gave me names of a number of Republican senators to go and see. I have seen them. And I think that it really does take kind of hand-to-hand real connection with people to understand it. I think the other part that is important, the budget is out of kilter, is the simplest way to say it. I do believe in the military. I'm a great supporter of the military, and they do need money, there's no question. But what is interesting is that our Defense Department officials, even going back to Secretary Gates, have basically said that they need the partnership of the State Department. And Secretary Mattis has said, if you don't give me diplomats, I have to have more ammunition. And so I think there really is something there. And that this really is going to take a lot of effort. If it isn't coming out of the White House, then the rest of us have to go out there and talk about it. I also do think, and what bothers me among the many things, is that some of the students that we have wonder if they should go into the State Department. And I say yes, absolutely. And part of the problem is if they don't go, not only are there problems now, but it's cutting off the pipeline. Where is the next Ambassador Bodine? And so I really do think that what we need to do is to make sure that we are not the victims of short-term thinking and really go out and talk to the people that will make the difference, which are members of Congress.
The other part of that, I mean, Congress, it is a democracy. Congress are representatives. And I think one of the frustrations that many of us have had over the years is within Washington, there is hopefully some understanding of the role of diplomats and diplomacy. But how do we get the word out? How do we, the American people, I know my own father, much as he supports what I do, has no idea what I do or what I did. How do we connect with the American people to explain to them the value of diplomacy and of diplomats, of why this core tool in the toolkit really does deserve greater support and greater...
Well, one of the things that I decided when I was in office, that we had to make foreign policy less foreign, so that it really, the people that are not in Washington get an understanding of why we have relationships with other countries at all. Why should we, in fact, give assistance to anybody? What does it mean? And I do think that while there are many people who are altruistic, I think that part of the issue here is how to talk about national security.
Right.
And that you need to have countries that are democratic or not falling apart in order for us to be safe. And so it's interesting, as I read the national security strategy, the new one, the first pillar is to protect the people of the United States, the territory and the people. That every president has to do. That's why a president is elected, is to protect the territory, the people, and the way of life. So it has to be explained how much we depend on it. And then the thing that I'm always nervous about is I think that we did get into the war in Iraq because of the fear factor. And it did come after 9/11, and so it was easy to kind of mobilize fear. I think we have to be careful not to overdo it, but I do think that it's a statement of fact that the fragile states are like petri dishes for the various people that don't wish us well. And so I do think it has to be explained in a way that it is appealing and interesting and really relevant to people that aren't like us who know where every country is and really know what the issues are.
Right.
But making it less foreign, I think, is the easiest way. And I do think people need to get out and talk to various groups around the country, whatever they are, whether they're friends or various organizations, but really understand that all America has to understand that.
Right. I know that many of us have tried to do that, and I know we have people who have been very involved in public affairs with us today. You talked about 9/11. You mentioned the fear factor. In your 2006 book, the mighty and the almighty, the reflections on America, God, and world affairs, which is certainly ambitious. You raised the question of the role of religion in diplomacy, and certainly it's a increasing part of the national dialogue. Religion, the freedom to practice, the freedom not to practice, is a core element of our democratic values and universal values. And religion has created some of the world's greatest achievements, but it's also been used as the excuse for some of the greatest atrocities. How do you see the best way to bring this the most fundamental of personal issues into politics in a way that is constructive?
Well, a little bit of background. When I was secretary, there were no Muslims employed at the State Department or that had a voice in what was going on. And also, most Americans didn't know much about Islam, much less the difference between Shia and Sunni and various things. I am the first secretary to have put Muslim holidays on the official calendar. And we began to have iftar dinners and various things. And then we thought that it would be useful, actually, to get a written document that would explain Islam, make it less foreign to people. And what happened was that it was all set to go, and then we left. And so this document was never issued. And so the truth is, I took a lot of the material in order to write this book, because there was the question, as we believe in separation of church and state. And so the question is, to what extent do our diplomats get involved in talking about religious issues abroad? And yet, if you don't know the religious background of a particular country these days and the various fissures, then you really can't do your job. And so I thought that what was important to do was that our Foreign Service officers that go to the Foreign Service Institute actually be not only trained in languages and history and culture of a country, but also the religious part of what goes on. That has now happened, I'm very pleased to say. I do think that we need to understand the motivating factors of a lot of religions. I never thought that I would be spending that much time reading the holy books, but the bottom line is that they all have some pretty grim parts and a lot of killing and swords. But they also have very similar language in terms of love, charity, and sharing in a number of different things. And I think that what is important is to try to find the common themes. And actually, Georgetown is a great place in terms of that, the Berkeley Center and all the various aspects. And I think we need to show that it's very much a part of how countries think, and that we need a little humility also in terms of that. We can't impose our religious beliefs on others just the way we can't impose democracy. That's an oxymoron. And so the bottom line is trying to figure out how to educate on that.
We have our ideals about religious pluralism and tolerance, but I think some people in this country are concerned about the rising intolerance domestically and how that affects both our abilities to operate abroad and our image abroad. Not our ideals, but some of our rhetoric and some of our practice.
One of the things, by the way, we all use the word tolerance, and I've decided I don't like the word. Because it basically means tolerate or put up with. And I think that what we need to do is respect other people's religions, which requires us to understand, and it isn't just generally, but I think that there is something about knowledge and creating respect in so many different ways. I do think that we need to figure out how to have these discussions in a non-threatening way and to be able to figure out what direction we go in on all of this. But it's going to take time. And I think that what I'm really troubled by at this stage, in case I didn't say that often enough in my speech, is that divisions are being exacerbated and that our government is basically a symptom of exacerbating divisions, and societies really require a common purpose. And one of the things, just to go back on NDI, we have been abroad in a variety of places, and we decided that it was not going to be ideological, that we were basically helping people to understand the nuts and bolts of democracy. So we were actually in Egypt at a certain point, and we were talking about the importance of creating coalitions and compromise. And one of the people we were working with said, yeah, like you guys. So at this stage, we're not exactly a good example of the kinds of things that we are telling others that they should think about.
All right. This will be my last question, then we will certainly open it up to the floor, and there's a microphone. You are the master of symbols and signaling. And so I'd like to ask you, what do you make of the second set of games, the parallel games, that are going on in Pyeongchang right now? The ones with your friends, the North Koreans, the South Koreans, us, and several other people. It's probably almost a Olympic standard, gold standard signaling.
Well, first of all, let me say that I hate to say this, but I take full responsibility for Dennis Rodman.
Okay,
because
I will let you have that one.
One of the things that happened when I went to North Korea, and by the way, I'm still the highest level sitting official to have been in Pyongyang to meet with their leader.
Okay.
And we didn't have an awful lot of intelligence on what it was really like. But we did know that Kim Jong-il, the father of this man, liked basketball. So I took over a basketball autographed by Michael Jordan, which they have in their Holy of Holies, which is what led to Dennis Rodman. I do think that the symbolism is an important one. And I think the contact is important. I think it is interesting that President Moon of South Korea says he's going to go to Pyongyang. And I think the following thing, and it really goes to the theme of what you're doing and what we're talking about. Talking and diplomacy is not a gift. It is how you actually deal with various problems. And I have had a lot of fun in my classes kind of with different definitions of diplomacy. One I love, which wouldn't be surprised came from a former French foreign minister, which was, he said, diplomacy is the way you need to talk to monsters.
Yes.
And so I do think that it is a mechanism. It is not something as though it's an approval mechanism.
Right.
And I do think it's important to kind of follow up. I have to say, I kind of wish that Vice President Pence had at least shaken hands with the sister. It wouldn't have.
The stony stare.
Yeah, but because I also do think that every one of our tools is, when people say every option is on the table, that's what it means. But diplomacy, as I said earlier, is the bread and butter part of it. I do think that some of the image is important. And according to what I read, but it could be wrong, is that they are now talking about having some kind of talks without preconditions. So having talks about talks. And I think that that is worth doing. And I think that it's also important, and I've had this idea, that when we left office, we really were in the middle of negotiations with the North Koreans over missile limits. And then one of the issues, the election of 2000 surprised many people, but it also surprised the North Koreans because the Bush administration decided not to continue with that.
Right.
We are concerned about missile limits. It isn't just the nuclear warhead, but the limits. And I think it wouldn't hurt, actually, to use that as a tool for discussions. That is just my personal opinion.
I think your personal opinion carries a great deal of weight. Maybe someday we will see the vice president with a meaningful pin. And you have a collection, so. I'd like to open it up to the audience. We have a microphone here. If you can make your way. I'm sorry about that. It's, and, okay. Also,
can't see.
I know, I'm having to do one of these. First of all, if you could identify yourself, and could you actually ask a question? And try to keep it brief so that the Secretary has time to answer it fully. So please go ahead.
Hi there, my name is Siona Sharma. I'm a sophomore studying STE at the School of Foreign Service. And my question is just that in your time in the government, whenever you had to work to kind of advance the American political agenda, how did you make sure that you didn't leave your morals or humanity at the door?
Well, it's interesting because part of when Dean Hellman said that I was a pragmatic idealist, my problem, there's always been this issue about whether you are an idealist or a realist. And I never knew whether I was an idealist or a realist, so I decided I was a realistic idealist, or I think it's a false dichotomy. And so what has to happen, I think, is there are always preparations for these meetings, and I see a lot of my former colleagues here who helped me with talking points and a variety of things. And it is very important to raise all kinds of issues. The ones that are could be viewed as having to involve with our security or some kind of a way where you go through the agenda. But I had a trick, and I would say, I have come a long way, so I must be frank. And then I always raised our human rights issues. They weren't always received very well, but I always felt that I was able to go across the whole gamut of things, and that it was my responsibility to defend America's national interests. And in fact, our view of human rights and generally in terms of treatment of others certainly fits into that. And the question is whether you raise it when you first walk in or whether you do it, but I believe that there is no discussion that you can ever have anywhere without raising our basic values.
Thank you.
Okay. Sir?
Good afternoon, Madam Secretary. My name is Jacob Hernandez, and I'm a proud student from the School of Continuing Studies in the inaugural intelligence program. First off, thank you for taking the time to share your experiences. For those of us hoping to continue in a career at the State Department, especially those of us who may have their oral assessment for the Counselor Fellow program on 15 March,
Just as an example.
what piece of wisdom would you offer so that we may effectively continue to promote democracy and balance that with the new American First direction of the current administration?
Well, it depends on who. I do think it's very important for you to state, if I may say so, something that I said in terms of the way that it is the job of the president and to protect our territory and our people and our way of life, and certainly for those that work in the government. And then your interpretation of that as being one where the United States can't be isolated, or your views. I think that you can't, this is my opinion, is basically hide where you're coming from, but also state the pride that you would have to represent the American people and be a public servant. I think that that's the part. And I know that I've been asked by a lot of people your age as to whether it's smart to work for this government. The answer is yes. I think that we definitely need people that have a good education, a good heart, and values be a part of this. Because if we were to, and not everybody agrees with me, but I really do think we can't say that they aren't using diplomats or diplomacy if nobody wants to do it, or that our intelligence services are not staffed by people that have intelligence. So I think.
Thank you very much, ma'am.
I would endorse now is the time to join the government. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Madam Secretary, for being here today. My name is Lucas. I'm a classmate of Jacob's in the School of Continuing Studies, and I was hoping you could comment today on what the endowment has coined sharp power, undemocratic, illiberal activities on the part of the Chinese Communist Party. You spoke of Mr. Putin. I was wondering if this issue is similar, different, greater than, equal to, or what is our response to this issue?
To what the Chinese
To what's called sharp power?
Sharp power. So
It's
basically the effort to encourage self-censorship on the part of Western academics, institutions, essentially tamping down criticism outside of China?
Well, I think this is a very difficult subject in every single way. One is that, first of all, I do think that it should be clear to everybody that the Chinese are out there filling a vacuum that we have left, and that what they are doing abroad is using their toolboxes in a way. I've been saying, the one belt, one road thing. They must have all gotten very fat because that belt is getting larger and larger. But I really do think that we need to know how to deal with them on the basis of what they're doing to compete with us. I also do think that in the appropriate places, as I've said, I think we need to say that when we meet with a variety of Chinese, whether they be other academics or government people, is to say that this is limiting their evolution in many different ways, that it's a mistake. I have to tell one small story here. About 6 years ago now, the International Department of the Chinese Communist Party got in touch with American political leaders. They wanted to have Democrats and Republicans go over and talk to them. Initially, the Republicans wouldn't go, and I thought, over my dead body, are the Democrats going to go meet with the communists by ourselves? Anyway, ultimately, the Republicans decided to go, and it was really kind of a pickup team. So what happened was I led the Democratic side, and Senator Tom Daschle and Howard Dean were on the Democratic side. And on the Republican side, there was a man called Rich Williamson, who was a Romney advisor, and Mike Duncan, who was the former head of the Republican Party, and then Vin Weber, a former member of Congress. Now, those of you that are diplomats know that at a meeting like that, you don't speak unless the Secretary of State says, Ambassador Bodine, would you like to say something? So what happened was the Chinese were explaining how their party worked, and I couldn't stand it after a while. So I said, excuse me, but our party system is a little bit different. And we don't know whether we have at that stage 75 million members, and nobody applies to party school, and nobody has a membership certificate or something. So because this was a pickup team, Governor Dean all of a sudden says, yeah, we do know how many people we have because of the great database I established. So then Mike Duncan, the Republican, not to be outdone, says, yeah, and we did psychological profiles of 200 million people, and the Chinese eyes are going around. And I had never seen this Rich Williamson before, the Republican. He writes me a note, forever endearing himself, saying, if that's so, how come we lost the election? So there we are, trying to figure it out. So the question is, why did the Chinese Communist Party want to have meetings with us? And I think it was because they do have pressure at the bottom of their pyramid. They do have urban-rural problems, a number of different things, and they were trying to figure out what we do. They are obviously not following what we do with this sharp power, but I think they are nervous in terms of what's going on and how to control it. And I think our job really is to keep pushing them on a number of issues and then trying to figure out what they're doing internationally.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Pierina Garcia. I'm a desperate Venezuelan public servant. I actually work in the National Assembly of Venezuela. And, well, Nicolas Maduro, the president, is about to get illegitimately re-elected for 6 more years in April. 6 more years of humanitarian crisis, death, and violation of human rights. In your opinion, according to your vast experience, how long until the international community considers that diplomacy is just not enough to defend democracy this time? Thank you.
I do think that there are other tools, and let me just say, I think the economic ones are the ones that are the most useful. I didn't agree when President Trump thought that we should have some kind of military means. But I do think that economically, the problem is that sanctions often hurt ordinary people, and from what I've read about what's going on in Venezuela, they're already starving and in very bad shape. And so the question is how to have some kind of targeted sanctions. At the same time, I think it's also important for outside groups like the National Democratic Institute or the Republican Institute to work with the opposition. And as I understand it, there really are questions as to whether the elections should be boycotted or whether they really need to participate. But it is very bad. And I think that some of the neighbors could be more helpful, and also, but I think that we have to do more than diplomacy. And I do think that sanctions, economic tools are the ones.
Thank you very much.
Sir?
Hi, my name is Josh Weiner. I'm a master's candidate in the communications program here. So as you know, 1968, it was such a transformative year. We're going to be recognizing the 50th anniversary of a lot of major events over the next few months. And I'm wondering, what do you hope the commentary will be about the legacy and significance of the Prague Spring 50 years on?
I have to say I have been thinking about that a lot, because one of the things I did spend, for those of you that are PhD students, writing a dissertation is hard work, and it took forever. I have to say, I had this subject of looking at what the role of the media was. And it was very interesting, because what was going on at that point was a discussion. By the way, Czechoslovakia was really a pretty interesting country, because during the interwar period, they had thrown all their nobility out the window, and so they basically were a pretty middle-class country, and also, in many ways, workers. And it had, at that stage in the interwar period, both a communist party and a socialist party. And they really were trying to figure out how to, it was called socialism with a human face, trying to figure out how to adjust what communism was doing in Czechoslovakia to some way that would benefit the people. What was interesting was that the press was the one that was carrying the various messages about how the political system could work. And by the way, the Czechoslovaks are sometimes known for halfway measures. And one of the things, the president of Czechoslovakia had actually gone to England before 1968. And he came back and he said, I now understand fully how to have socialism with a human face. They drive on the left-hand side of the road. And in order not to make it too complicated, we're just going to have the trucks drive on the left-hand side of the road. So halfway measures don't work exactly. But the thing that happened, I think, in '68 was that the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia actually put an end to the evolution of communism, because the Czechoslovaks had really been working on that. And I tried that out on President Gorbachev when I met him, and he agreed that they are the ones by not allowing some evolution to take place. And so I think '68 is remembered as a kind of heroic attempt, not fully finished in any shape or form, not enough relationship between the leaders and the working class. But it was a very brave and interesting time. But the Soviets themselves put an end to the evolution. And so when Putin says that the greatest disaster of the 20th century was the dissolution of the Soviet Union, they did it themselves. And by the way, we cannot forget in dealing with Putin that we are dealing with a KGB agent. He has played a weak hand very well. Propaganda is his major tool.
Yes.
Thank you.
Never underestimate your enemy. Yes, ma'am.
Secretary
And I
Albright,
think you and the woman behind you will be the last two questions.
Secretary Albright, it was an honor to hear from you today. I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on the rise of nationalism in several Eastern European countries, and what impact you see that having on the future of diplomacy within the European Union.
I am very troubled by what is going on, and there are a couple of people here that are on the board of the National Democratic Institute. We've been talking about this. Did we do something wrong in terms of being so euphoric about what was going on in Central and Eastern Europe? What is it that really happened there? And I can argue that we might have spent too much time with intellectuals and the elite and didn't think enough about the working class and a number of different aspects. Because clearly what has happened is that there has been, again, kind of a focus on divisions in society, the rich and the poor, and various other aspects of not having safety nets, a number of different things. I think that we really need to think through what happened. Why? Viktor Orban is somebody that I met in the middle 80s when I went there with the National Democratic Institute. He was a superstar dissident. He came to the United States a number of times. People thought he was just fantastic. And then all of a sudden he goes, the Fidesz was the Young People's Party. And the history of it was that all of a sudden there were questions about what the communists had done, how had they operated. I won't go through the whole story, but he now turns out to be the most illiberal of the various people that had had that role. Poland was also a very interesting issue because Wałęsa and Solidarity was the basis of an awful lot of what went on in the late 80s and 90s everywhere. And the Czechs, I think the same, kind of what actually has happened. And I think part of the issue is the whole issue of identity that has come up. And I think it's important to remember, and again, there are many things, we're going to celebrate a lot of anniversaries, but this year, with the end of World War I, empires had fallen apart, and those countries were created on the basis of national identity. I very rarely say anything critical of what the Czechs call Woodruff-Wilson. There is a Woodruff-Wilson railroad station in practically every town in the Czech Republic. But that's a real question about self-determination and the 14 points, and I think we need to understand that. So then, and I did a lot of survey work in the 90s, and most of the people in those countries really felt that they wanted to be Europeans. The problem is that all of a sudden the European Union and the bureaucrats in Brussels seem very faceless. And even though the Poles get more money from the European Union than most, I think they felt that there are parts of how the system was working was not suiting them. And I think that it's something that needs to be studied, unfortunately, trying to figure out the double-edged sword of globalization, which is faceless, and then this desire for identity. And then with the refugees coming in, it makes it even more complicated. And I'm very troubled by what has happened, and I think we shouldn't give up, but we need to figure out how do you, in fact, promote democracy in difficult situations. How many levels of, not to exacerbate the divisions, but to really work across the board.
Okay. And you have the last question.
Secretary Albright, thank you for your remarks today. My name is Anna. I'm a student in the Global Human Development Program at SFS. I'm wondering if you would be able to share your thoughts on the role of women in American diplomacy, and what advice would you offer to young women who are interested in pursuing careers both in government and as practitioners of diplomacy?
So let me just say, when I first came to teach in the 80s at Georgetown, Georgetown had been a single-sex school, and I actually was hired and funded by a foundation to get women more involved in foreign policy. I could do whatever I wanted, fortunately. I didn't want to just have a women's program because I really did think that diplomacy is a co-ed activity and that women had to figure out how to operate within that particular scene. And I've given a lot of speeches where there was a time that the only impact that a woman could have in diplomacy was as a spouse and pour tea into some ambassador's lap. And so it was very important to show that we needed women ambassadors and women throughout the system. I see Milan here. What happened was I actually, when I became secretary, I made women's issues central to American foreign policy, not just because I'm a feminist, but because we know that societies are more stable when women are economically and politically empowered and when American women are able to be a part of our diplomatic service. I think that it's never simple, and I do think that women and men together can play a very large role in diplomacy, and it requires an education to do it, best here. But I really do think that, and I have said this, and I never want to be insulting to half the audience, but there's no room for mediocre women. There's plenty of room for mediocre men. So you have to work exceptionally hard, and you will make it in the Foreign Service.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was a wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and I think the response speaks for itself. We were honored that you accepted the award and that you were able to speak with us today. And this was fantastic. I'm sure I have something more eloquent to say. You've been enlightening, you've been inspiring, and I think you've recommitted a room full of young diplomats, policymakers, and global citizens to stay in the game and to move forward. And I can't thank you enough for that. This is the Trainor Lecture and Award, and you have very kindly given us a brilliant and inspiring lecture. So we now have to give you an award. We would have given it in any event, but we knew it was going to be good. We debated what would be the most appropriate, what would be the most useful. We certainly were not going to give you a pin. You have the most remarkable collection, which I've had the pleasure to look at. You already hold the Mortara Endowed Chair as Distinguished Professor in the Practice of Diplomacy. So what we would hope that you would also accept a chair as the 2018 Trainor Award recipient for excellence in the conduct of diplomacy. It doesn't come with an endowment. We're broke. It also doesn't come with any heavier teaching load. But we do hope that it will grace your office and remind you always of the very high esteem that your colleagues from state, your colleagues on the faculty, and your many students have for everything that you have contributed to scholarship and diplomacy and the world. And so I present you with the ISD chair. You're sitting in it.
That's great. Great. Thank
Your name
you.
is on the back. So there you are.
Okay. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have to say,
Two standing ovations.
What?
That's pretty good.
I can always use another chair, but let me just say that I'm deeply honored by the Trainor Award because of everything that it means. Thank you so much, and for the legendary service, and also for what ISD is doing and what you're doing. I can't tell you how pleased I am to be back in this family, that it is really a wonderful place, and I'm honored to have great students and wonderful fellow faculty. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Our pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you.